Hello and welcome to this week's reflection. As you can see, Donnie is making another appearance. This sweatshirt has kind of become my security blanket as the election has approached. This is my blankie, and I'm Linus. And it will continue to be afterwards until like whatever shakes out. Whether that's Civil War II, Trump's Electric Boogaloo, or he just goes off and starts selling stuff like Larry King on late night TV and just selling everything, which he'll totally do. Whether or not which one of those happens. But anyways, I can wait till next week's reflection since the election will have happened by then. For the most part, we still have votes to count and all that stuff. But it's going to be a long month. But by then we'll have a sense. Looking at all the books we had to read. This week I'm oddly enough going to focus on one that I didn't really get to read. I only got to thumb through because it came like an hour before we had class. And it's mainly because the conversation surrounding it and just what I saw in that hour was really interesting to me, and the conversation surrounding it was super cool. But I wanted to talk about this because when thumbing through it for the little bit of time I did, I could clearly get a sense that it's not like traditional scholarship that like I've partaken in or been reading while earning my degrees. It's not a traditional like 15-page paper. Each one is a chapter and a paper style thing, and it's just a boring book. It's got a combination of poetry, and it looks like some excerpts from short stories or writing, and then as well as academic stuff too. And I think that as we talk about like this sort of her scholarship and this sort of style of scholarship and subject is a direct result of her being told by the powers that be that like Chicana studies wasn't a thing worth studying, and she's like, no, it is, and took it up, and then figured out a way to kind of make the academic world accept her on her terms and include her in their realm. And I found that really interesting because we got to talk about that and like how this feels like a text that is explicitly towards academia, like being like, this isn't for you, this is for me and for Chicana studies and for the study of a group of people who have been marginalized and like erased from an existence, or they've been trying. And I found that interesting because we brought up, and you only got to briefly touch on it, that it felt like a form of signifying, and it brought up that the quote from Gates, I think, where Kochman argues that signifying depends upon the signifier repeating what's, or oh no, it's therefore in order to reverse this, signifying can be used in order to reverse the status of a relationship heretofore harmonious. Signifying can also be employed to reverse or undermine pretense or even one's opinion about one's own self. So I found that was interesting, and we didn't get to talk about that. And I think that is kind of what she is doing, is she is using this sort of not your scholarship, but up to the standards of your scholarship in terms of the research that's being done and the time and effort and transparency that's being put into it. And it's a form of signifying to undermine the idea that like marginalized cultures in America weren't worth or aren't worth studying in terms of literature and just their culture in general. And we got to kind of talk about it with and this segues into talking about cultural indigenous studies, because that's a great example of how currently they're trying to reverse that trend. And I found that we got to talk about that, and I didn't really think we got to talk enough about that, of the idea of showing that like the cultures that have been traditionally marginalized or aren't dead and gone, like indigenous culture, Chicana culture, depending on where you're at, like all of those cultures aren't dead and gone, and too often we talk about them like they are, because and we didn't get to talk about it, and I wanted to bring it up because like when we do American Lit, like we did American Lit, and most of like the stuff that we talked about in terms of indigenous stories was American Lit 1 or early American Lit, like pre-Civil War, and then as we go, it kind of like dies out. So it gives you an impression that like it's a culture that is dead, and it made me sad because like while doing that and while being in AmLit 2 and only studying canon and it being very much more traditional scholarship of here's your your big name dead white folks with a sprinkle of those who kind of like women and people of color who deserve a little recognition. Um, where sorry, trying to catch my thought again. Oh, what I was saying is it made me sad because like when reading Trickster Tales, like I got the sense like just from the way academia runs that like these are a thing long dead and gone, and then I'm scrolling through Facebook while reading in Amlet 2, and I see a story pop up of a Canadian author who is currently writing Trickster Tales that have been modernized, and like the trickster, instead of like doing the poop one that you had us read. I can't remember the story. That's all I remember about is lots and lots of poop that a guy poops. Instead of that being the story, they've updated the tradition of the trickster like selling weed on the res to help the family pay bills and like using them to foster a sense of community and tell tales. And that was an epiphany moment for me and interesting because it was like, oh, this culture's not dead and gone. There's currently authors working in this realm to keep this alive, and I found that to be interesting when talking about indigenous studies, how it's not just sociology, anthropology, archaeology. It's like all of them combined, and literary studies and the humanities have all come together and created a nice little like baby, for lack of a better word, where like a field baby, there you go, yeah, a field of theory baby, I don't know what you want to call it, where they're starting to actually try to be interdisciplinary and trying to actually have real world implications and impact, I guess, while doing what we love to do. And I really think that that's interesting, and I feel like that's something that we need to do. And I think post-colonial studies is doing it as well, but not to the same extent as indigenous studies, because post-colonial, I mean, it gets kind of murky, and I'm not nearly an expert of how we will go about that because it feels like, I don't know. Anyways, I'm going to stop before I get into weird territory. That is my reflection, and hopefully that made sense and was focused enough. And have a good weekend. Happy Halloween.